So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this third international Big History Conference titled Building Big History, Research and Teaching. My name is Esther Kwadakkers. I'm a lecturer in Big History here at the University of Amsterdam and also a board member of the International Big History Association. And on behalf of the International Big History Association, I would very briefly like to thank a few people before we officially open the conference. First of all, I would like to thank you for attending in such great numbers. So, thank you for being here. Secondly, I would like to thank all the members of the IBHA Programming Committee and Conference Organizing Committees for their hard work in putting this conference together. I won't mention any names because I'm going to take this brief, but you all know who you are. Thank you very much. Thirdly, very briefly, I would like to thank our assistants, Melanie and Jasmijn in the back, and our volunteers, who are working hard to make this conference into a great success. And last but not least, I would like to thank our university and our Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies in particular, for supporting our plan to host this conference so enthusiastically. And I would therefore like to ask on behalf of the university, I would like to ask the director of our Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, which is the home base of Big History at this university, to basically formally open the conference. So Lucy, if you would like to come up here.
Well, welcome at the University of Amsterdam. We are so proud to host the third International Big History Association Conference, the first outside the United States. And the title is Building Big History, Research and Teaching. Big History and the University of Amsterdam have a long history. Not 4.7 million years ago, the period Big History describes, but 24 years ago when Johan Goudsblom visited David Christian at Macquarie University. And I'm so honored that Professor Goudsblom is here and will give the keynote today. There he learned about the course Big History, and that David has been teaching since 1989 and brought the syllabus home to the University of Amsterdam. And back here, and together with Fred Speer, he used the syllabus to create the University of Amsterdam version of the Big History course. The way history was taught was unprecedented at the university and a great example of an interdisciplinary approach where humanities, social sciences and natural sciences all equally contributed to the big picture of the world. The course became a big success and wildly popular. At one point, more students came in than the largest lecture hall at the university could handle. To cite a law student, this course is what I expected science would be about. Every student should attend a course like this next to his or her study to broaden the mind, which is vital for an academic and for academia. He mentioned the motto of the course, the poem Time of Vazalis, which also impressed and inspired him. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a translation in English, so I can't cite the poem. But a lot has changed since then. Johan Goudsblom retired in 1997, and Fred Speer was joined by Esther Kwadakkers in 2006. The original Big History course still exists and is still popular, but no longer the only one. The University of Amsterdam has developed several different Big History courses at several different universities throughout the Netherlands. On top of that, other institutes, other universities, applied universities, and very importantly, high schools have recently started doing so as well. As a result, the Netherlands now has one of the highest densities of Big History courses in the world. And we're very proud of that. And I'm not sure if Johan Goudsblom had expected that when he brought back the syllabus from Sydney. And we in the Netherlands are not done yet. We intend to help Big History develop further in the upcoming years. Here at the University of Amsterdam, we recently created another permanent position in Big History to safeguard the future of Big History at the University of Amsterdam for the years to come. We've been working on developing open online content, a Big History MOOC together with eminent UVA professors. The Free University and Naturalis will start in September. And we are working towards a minor to offer students the possibility to deepen their knowledge of Big History. Others are working really hard to incorporate Big History into our high schools and even in our primary school curriculum. So world domination for Big History, isn't it? Yeah. While doing so, it is of course necessary to learn collectively. That is what we hope to achieve in the next few days. We hope we will all be able to share and build on each other's ideas so that after the conference we all go home inspired and eager to further develop Big History, both in terms of research and teaching. I want to end with the last 3 lines of the poem, which I couldn't resist to translate, at least a humble attempt to do so. How could I not have known this, not seeing it more clearly, earlier in time? How can I ever forget? I wish you all an inspiring conference.
My name is Fred Spier, and right now it's my task to introduce Professor Goudsblom. He is a professor of sociology. He's been a professor of sociology for a long time at this university. And not only has he developed eminent sociology himself, he introduced the sociology of Norbert Elias here at this university and actually made him world famous and did an outstanding job in creating a discussion forum here. Lots of people who came involved and helped to develop that. And he's always had an extraordinary wide-ranging interest in almost anything. And I think that is probably what inspired him to go to Australia, pick up that syllabus, talk with David, and then come back here and start a Big History course. So I think you have, really extraordinary achievements, and I'm so happy that you're here to give your keynote. I invite you to come up and do it. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Fred, first of all, thank you for your kind words. I have a small request, is that I don't even have to explain. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Water is even more precious than fire. Fred did not announce a title, and that was for good reasons, because preparing this lecture actually amounted to 7 titles in search of seven titles in search of a lecture. But the 2 that play through each other and that are recognizable, I think, are, first of all, fire and the expanding anthroposphere. And the other title was Big History and Sociology. I have the feeling that my voice is not what it should be. Can you all understand me? Thanks to the microphone. I don't use PowerPoint, but still one electric device I cannot do without. The eventual title is Fire and the Expanding Anthroposphere. And I begin with some preliminary remarks. First of all, that I'm greatly honored by the invitation. I vividly remember my encounter with David, and that was in the year 1992. I must admit, never heard of you before, but my friend Stephen Mendel, who was at that time a professor of sociology at Monash in Melbourne, had made a lecture tour for me to 7 or 8 different universities, and Macquarie was one of them, and my host was you, David. And I remember very much how well our first conversation went. There were the 3 of us, I must add, and my wife Maria was also with me. But I was immediately fascinated by the project of big history, as at that time primarily an educational project. And I have continued to wonder how big history could be applied to my own discipline, sociology. It made me realize that sociology actually started as a truly big science and then shrank to its present limited size, limited not in the number of students and teachers, but in the scope of its content. The founding fathers, Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer, had started big. Both were, by the way, natural scientists by training. Comte came even before Darwin. When Darwin later read about Comte's ideas, he found them thoroughly congenial. Comte distinguished 3 major stages in human thought, corresponding to major stages in human social organization. First, there was inevitably a stage dominated by theology, then a second one by philosophy or metaphysics, and a third one in historical sequence of emergence was science. The scientific age of positivism was within sight, Comte said. And the whole system of sciences that at that time in France were taught at the university could be traced back to this 6-fold order in which these various disciplines developed, according to Comte, following the principle of increasing complexity. Mathematics came first, and sociology, enveloping it all, came last. Spencer, a contemporary of Darwin, collected far more empirical material than Comte and ordered it all in an elaborate evolutionary scheme with alternating spurts of differentiation and integration, applicable to every aspect of the known world, from cosmology to sociology. As I have told David before, I think that both Comte and Spencer deserve a name in the intellectual pedigrees of big history. They can also be hailed by sociologists as the founders of truly big sociology, a branch of sociology and social anthropology that was never completely cut off, but cultivated only by a few lone scholars, such as Gerhard Lenski and Norbert Elias in sociology, and Leslie White and Marvin Harris in anthropology. Spencer, by the way, did not go out of his way to make himself popular with historians. In his autobiography, he stated that sociology stood to history as a vast building stands to heaps of stones and brick. And, I quote literally, the highest office which the historian can discharge is that of so narrating the lives of nations as to furnish materials for a comparative sociology. That was not very good, how do you call it nowadays, public relations. Let me now turn to the idea of big sociology. It is applicable without any doubt to early sociology. And ever since the beginning of the 20th century certainly, and even stronger after 1945, the time perspective of sociology was shortened. And after 1945, a sort of frozen picture of the social world was adhered to. Social change was seen as of secondary importance, relevant mostly for countries that had to catch up in the process of modernization. Everything not immediately recognizable as social was rejected, and this aversion was strongly increased by a strong suspicion of biology, which was then associated with thinking in terms of race and with eugenetics as practiced by the defeated enemy, the Nazis. Much was made, I remember it vividly because I was a student at that time, much was made of the alleged dilemma nature or culture. It was treated as a binary distinction, a binary opposition, which it is not. I think it's much better to replace it by nature plus culture. What we call culture can only coexist with nature, and whereas nature can exist independently of culture. Nature is a precondition for culture. It should be recognized as such, not left out for moral or political reasons. Partly because of this same one-sidedness, sociologists have also kept themselves away from fire. I earned the exceptional distinction of being satirized in one of the most serious journals that ever existed, the Dutch Journal of Sociology, Mens en Maatschappij. But it satirized an interview that I had given. So that was the exceptional distinction I mentioned. But my colleagues in other countries also show very little interest in the subject of fire, as if our societies were not to a very high degree powered by fire, in trains, automobiles, airplanes, in the production of food, clothing, furniture, and also obeying all the laws and regulations to keep fire and smoke at a safe and comfortable distance. The increasing use of electricity adds to the illusion that in the lives of modern urban citizens, fire plays a role only on ceremonial occasions. Even the organizations of voluntary and professional firefighters receive next to no attention from sociologists. And yet, at the same time, fuel is one of the biggest commodities in international trade, and it plays a major role in geopolitics. To my regret, fire is also mentioned only once in the book This Fleeting World, this marvelous little manual for all big historians. There is one reference to fire stick farming, and that's it. I hope that what I'm saying here now will help to make a small change in the second edition, which is sure to come, of this excellent little book. I, on my part, have to confess that I find it difficult to connect my interest in fire with big history. I can understand that there must have been a phase in the history of our Earth when there was no fire. So I speak only about the Earth. That is already an enormous reduction of the subject matter of big history. But for a long first phase on Earth, there was no fire. 3 ingredients need to be present at the same location simultaneously for fire to occur: heat, oxygen, and fuel. And during this first phase, heat was available now and then at various times and places through the activities of volcanoes or through lightning. But there was not enough oxygen nor fuel. Then, as a byproduct of unicellular forms of life, oxygen penetrated the atmosphere in ever larger concentrations, but still there was no fuel. Only when life colonized the dry surfaces of the planet, fuel became available in the form of organic, carbon-containing matter. When sufficient quantities of fuel had been amassed, fire erupted in enormous blasts that engulfed the Earth's entire land surface. The greatest blaze on Earth may well have ravaged then. Gradually, the blasts became smaller. Fires occurred more often, burning down areas that would yield only smaller quantities of fuel for the fire next time. A homeostasis process began, not unsimilar to the balance between hosts and parasites that William McNeill sketched in Plagues and Peoples. Perhaps we can say that a new phase in the history of fire on Earth had begun, the self-domestication of fire. I know it sounds odd, but it is defensible as an appropriate image. Fires decreased in size, they became less capricious and more regular, and, as we would now say, predictable. Although, of course, the name wildfire was very much applicable to them. I shall not be offended if you reject the idea of self-domesticating fire, as long as you agree with me that the phenomenon, I mean, is worth considering, if need be by any other name. As a sociologist, poorly educated in the physical sciences, this is about all I have to say about fire that might be relevant to big history. When I wonder, did fire first flare up on the planet Earth? Problem of chronology. My colleague in geology, Peter Westbroek, lent me a book by the Earth system scientists Tim Lenton and Andrew Watson, Revolutions That Made the Earth, published in 2011. From that book I learned that the oldest evidence of fire on Earth dates from approximately 425 million years BP, before present, about 100 million years after the emergence of plant life. Starting around 370 million years before present, the proportion of oxygen in the air became so high that worldwide forest fires could occur. I think the same dates approximately are mentioned by Fred Speer in his book on big history. I'm still far back in big history with no humans in sight. Unfamiliar territory for me. My aim is to narrow the argument down in the direction of human history. And I wonder, the question will return several times, why fire is such a neglected object of study, except in highly specialized academies for firefighters. In my own work, I must admit, I've hardly paid any attention to fire. I published a book about Dutch society in 1967. As far as I can remember, as a proper sociologist, I omitted fire. Then, in 1977, I wrote a book about sociology. I did mention fire once, but failed to include it in the index. Fortunately, I was able to find it back. It's one paragraph. Controls over nature, as well as controls over other people, are closely connected with self-control. The first great steps in the mastery of nature, the conquest of fire, the invention of hunting weapons, the domestication of cattle, the early development of horticulture and agriculture, all involved a certain mastery of self, an overcoming of fears, a giving up of immediate satisfactions for the sake of deferred gratification. In the course of social development, most of these elementary controls have become built so deeply into each new generation as to become seemingly part of man's natural endowments. They are, however, results of long processes of civilization. So here fire and civilization were at least gathered for once in one paragraph. But the book Fire and Civilization remained to be written. This passage that I just read to you is of course very much in the spirit of Norbert Elias, with the emphasis on the interdependent mechanisms of control over natural, social and psychological events. It was written just a little bit too early to reflect the influence of William McNeill, who was to become my second great self-adopted teacher. I never sat in the class of either of them. I adopted them myself as gurus. I read Plagues and Peoples on the strength of a favorable review by Geoffrey Barrowclough in the New York Review of Books. The book made me realize that the conventional limits of sociology were far too narrow. They left out the long past in which the human world changed to its present shape, and by focusing only the intraspecific relations among humans, sociologists also deprive themselves of the opportunity to study the mutual relations between humans and other species, be they mammals or insects. In the ecological sphere in which humans live and have their impact on other species, the anthroposphere, fire is something very special. It's dangerous and destructive, but it can be brought under control. We can imagine a classification of all animals, carnivores and herbivores, and classify them with one single criterion, whether they are able to control fire. It would be a binary classification. At one side, the human species, at the other side, all others. In the long run, what was originally exclusively human became also universally human. And exclusively and universally even more than either tool use or language. This, incidentally, is a physiological model. First there was none, no human group with fire. Then there were some did and others did not have fire. And then all groups had fire, and whatever human groups had refused for whatever reason to adopt fire, it disappeared. Maybe the whole process of acquiring fire and controlling it could be a sign of harmonization. It's an open question, but I know questions are invited for this conference, and this is a good one, I think. Of course, gaining control does not mean absolute control, nor can it be reduced to a single event, an invention. As the primatologist Francis Burford argues, there must have been a very long-term association with fire before control began. Implied in controlling fire is the discovery and use of fuel. Everybody, including economists and economic historians, nowadays recognize its enormous current importance. But I rarely find references to the fact that the same materials, coal, oil, and gas, that are today of such vital importance for world trade and for geopolitics, have no positive value whatsoever for any other higher animal, whether mammal or bird or fish. I'd like to make a variation on a well-known statement about dirt by the British anthropologist Mary Douglas. Dirt is matter out of place. This is, of course, a completely anthropocentric definition. But in a similar fashion, we can say that fuel is matter fit for burning. It's a special kind of matter which can be defined in terms of its function for us humans. I like to use the word matter as part of a triad: matter, energy, information. The first time I referred to this triad was in the opening sentence of a book on environmental history. That sentence went as follows: human life, like all life, consists of matter and energy, structured and directed by information. I sent a copy of the book to William McNeill. As I expected, I soon received his reply. He wrote me that he had enjoyed the book. He appreciated in particular the first sentence of my introductory chapter. I immediately looked up that first sentence again, meanwhile wondering if perhaps McNeill had only read the first chapter, or the first page, or the first paragraph, or the first line. Or was he right? Was it a significant observation, caught in a few seemingly casual words? I think the latter is true. I have used the same statement often since. I added a few more words: specific combination. I would say that human life, like every other form of life, consists of specific combinations of matter and energy, structured and directed by information. Every form of life, from bacteria to whales or sequoias, consists of matter, occupying space, obeying the law of gravity. It is driven by energy, which makes it grow and capable of adapting to changes in light and temperature. And all its behavior is directed or guided by information. Information is the most difficult of the three terms to delineate. I use it in the very general sense first developed by biologists, in which it can refer to codes contained in DNA, as well as to knowledge acquired by learning by humans, by other animals, by plants or trees. My favorite example of what I mean by information and with the whole triad of matter, energy, and information, can be found in my house. It's a grandfather's clock, made around 1900, that I wind up once a week. The clock has been manufactured around 1900 by human hands, and its spring has been wound up by a human hand, mine, and that hand has transferred a tiny bit of energy from my living body to the clock. The clock was built and continues to serve as a means of orientation. It tells me what time it is, where I find myself in the worldwide configuration of movements that we all experience as the passage of time. Long before the internet, this mechanical clock was already part of a worldwide web of information, time measurement. Concepts like conflict, competition, struggle, cooperation, interdependence, all originally referred to intra-specific human social relations. And, as McNeill showed in Plagues and Peoples, they can all be applied as a vocabulary of human relations to inter-specific relations with other species. Thus, Plagues and Peoples provided for me a model of interspecific relations with rats and lice affecting human affairs, and this is the important point, human affairs affecting the lives of rats and lice. I remember teaching about this subject shortly after the book had appeared for a class of sociology majors. When they got the point, two radical Marxist students stood up and ostentatiously left the classroom. Instead of simply blaming capitalism for the oppression of the poor lot of peasants, I presented McNeill's socio-ecological analysis, in which rats and lice played an even equally important and perhaps even more important part. There's one of my favorite quotations in both big history and sociology that I would like to read to you. They are the opening words of a public lecture that Turgot, the brilliant French politician and economist, delivered in the year 1750. And he spoke as follows: "The phenomena of nature, subject to constant laws, are enclosed in a circle of revolutions which are always the same. Everything is reborn, everything perishes, and through successive generations in which vegetation and animal life reproduce themselves, time merely restores at each instant the image which it has caused to disappear." Very elegantly put. The succession of man, however, presents a changing spectacle from century to century. Reason, the passions, liberty produce new events without end. All ages are linked to each other by a series of causes and effects which bind the present state of the world with all those which have preceded it. The ideology of progress, but there's another reason why it also deserves the attention of us engaged in history and big history, and that is, excellent though it may be, and beautifully written though it may be, it contains a terrible error. If I were now lecturing to a class of students, I would ask them to name the error, detect it, but you are all adults, you've been able to follow my argument, I hope. So you know what Turgot's great error was. that the phenomena of nature, subject to constant laws, never change. So he made a beautiful distinction between the human world that is subject from generation to alterations, and the natural world, which in his view, in the year 1750, was as static as it looks at first sight. So I have two reasons for quoting Turgot. It's a tribute to his writing and his insight, and it's also the criticism that I can make by virtue of the very progress in knowledge that he finds so important. I skip a few pages, as you see, and I want to return to the theme of big history and sociology. How does sociology fit into big history? Well, that should not be difficult to answer. The rise of sociology is part of human history, and as such, a part, no matter how tiny, of big history. This should be obvious. But now for the highly non-obvious mirror question. How does big history fit into sociology? If it does so at all, I must humbly say. Well, I think to begin with, we can play the same trick with sociology that David Christian played with history. We let ourselves not be inhibited by modesty and add the word big. There is a sociological principle, well known, to the effect that when people call a situation real, it will be real in its consequences. By calling something big, we make it big. This is not complete nonsense, although it comes dangerously close to it, but sometimes it works, this principle. But I prefer to give a more substantive answer. Sociology as an intellectual discipline began its career in the first decades of the 19th century. In 1838, the word was first launched in print, and we know who invented it: Auguste Comte. Good old Comte, I can now say after I mentioned him several times already. And he did so by combining philosophical argument with what was at that time state-of-the-art knowledge of contemporary science and scholarship. And the sociology of big history should include a sociology of knowledge, similar to that which Comte and his predecessor Turgot also embraced, in which we recognize that no matter how far we bend ourselves toward a stage, toward a position that has nothing to do with humankind anymore, where we cannot be accused of anthropocentrism, there's no position that we can then occupy and from where we can proudly communicate we are there. No, we can't. We are captured in this anthropocentric position. Let me end with a few observations about fire. First of all, there is an intriguing question of when and where fire was first used by humans. If we were able to answer those questions, we would know the chronology of human fire use. For archaeologists doing actual research in the field, these are the most important questions. Recently, there has been a great deal of movement in this area. For several decades, the oldest sites containing traces of human fire use were supposed to date from about 250,000 years before present. But in the last few decades, sites in Israel and South Africa have shifted the boundaries of accepted evidence for oldest human fire use to 700,000 to 800,000 years. And I think it's unlikely that the near future will hold no further extensions in store into even earlier times. In the second half of the 20th century, there already were some outsiders, not archaeologists, who postulated that humans might have lived with fire for a far longer time. These heretics against archaeological orthodoxy have been joined in the 21st century by at least two new discussants, Francis Burford, whom I already mentioned, and Richard Wrangham, both of them primatologists. I find myself in great sympathy with their stance. We share an interest in the problem of what made humankind different from other animals in so many respects, including this one criterion of being able to control fire. Today, the interests are often primarily directed at what we humans have in common with other animals. This is a reaction against the view that was dominant until well into the 20th century, expressing a sense of great superiority of the human species over all other species. The change of opinion has been very evident in the field of biology. One of the most prominent experts is the primatologist Frans de Waal, who has written fascinating work on the group life of chimpanzees and bonobos. But I would love to read a similar report about politics and morality among those close relatives of us, written by a bonobo or a chimpanzee. That is, of course, no more than a facetious wish, but still, it may serve as a correction of stance leaning over too much toward what do we all have in common, the primates and we. There is, of course, a lot. Every human being can be described in that same very general formulation that I gave before, but at least as interesting are all the many differences. In my book, Fire and Civilization, I have made no claim to settle issues of chronology. They are beyond my own expertise, although I think I have shown my sympathy for people like Burford and Wrangham. The main points I wanted to make regarding the initial transition from the phase when there were no creatures at all on Earth controlling fire to the first stage when some groups, at least for some time, for some periods, had some control over fire. That remains a spectacular event, and it made, that is the first point I want to make about the book, where I would now give a different emphasis than I did at first writing. It set us on a journey as humans where we had two sources of energy. And again, we were unique. We use food, as every other animal does, and we use fuel. And most fuel is inedible to any other animal, as long as it is not used for a purpose, cooking or other. And this combination of the universal and exclusive use of fire and the edge this has given us in the quest for survival with all the other species around, formed a legitimation for doing this kind of work in my time as a sociologist, an emeritus I may add. At first, when I accepted the invitation to give the opening address, I gave as a provisional title, The Expanding Anthroposphere. And I continue to see that that is a major theme on which I continue to work, I would almost say day and night, but every once in a while I have closed a particular chapter in my work, and actually I should have brought a whole book, but I was too lazy. It is a very heavy book. But my latest publication is a chapter in a book edited by David Christian, The Cambridge History of the World, and I have written a chapter on fire and fuel in human history. And I show how, it's a very bad image, but it occurs to me now, how the happy wedding between humankind and fire perhaps is becoming less and less happy and should seriously think about a divorce. And that is the coda that I wrote to my piece on fire and fuel in human history. And please allow me to end with reading that. It's 200 words. We humans are unable to predict the future, and we always will be. With an appeal to this observation that, like so many paradoxes, is only seemingly paradoxical, I shall end this chapter with a brief speculation. We have today a rapidly developing World Wide Web of information, which was never planned as such, but is the unforeseen result of a multitude of planned human actions and interactions. Reflecting about a possible scenario for a next stage in the history of human use of fire and fuel, it seems reasonable to suppose that unless very drastic changes happen, we will continue to need large supplies of extrasomatic energy, probably even a great deal larger than today. We shall have to restrain our habitual tendency to rely on fire and fuel. Instead, we may turn our efforts to a more direct and efficient use of sunlight than we have been able to achieve until now. If technologists could succeed in meeting this challenge, they could help build up a worldwide web of energy, connecting the northern and the southern, as well as the eastern and the western hemispheres, creating a network in which it would always be summer and the sun would never set. Thank you. Thank you. Denk het even mee. Ik kan het even van me op. Dank je wel.
Well, thank you very much, Joop, for doing such a wonderful presentation. And can you imagine how fortunate I've been to have such an excellent supervisor and teacher? It's been a great experience. Thank you.